Hey, welcome to a 360-degree evaluation and state of the ministry here at Vernon Church. I'm always excited to be able to do it here at the place that gives me my bread and butter. I'm a youth pastor here, and so I'm going to be you'll see how I word it. I word it as a participant, an observer participating within the actual study. But what you're going to see is a state of the ministry of our local church, and I'm excited for the elements that I found and that we found together with our team, and it was so fun. So we're going to hear about the state of the ministry of our local church. The focal group fits prominently between a church that desires to thrive but has a few concerning areas of decay. About a third of millennial Americans, according to Pew, are now nuns, and they are dissociating with every segment of the church. The Vernon Church attempts to equip and engage what they call hyphen or college-age students. They endeavor to educate young adults on discovering their true identity in Christ. And then they hope that they would reciprocate the same to their peers. In other words, they have become a disciple. Now we want you to make a disciple. And then instead of addition, we're hoping for multiplication. However, we noticed a stark decline when students graduated from high school. Very disheartening for a youth pastor of 5 years. And it's been a consistent trend for the church for over a decade. Now, in their favor, the attempt to place a director over the Department of College-Age Students came roughly about 2 to 3 years ago. And it was their youth pastor. Now, the youth pastor was poised to focus on 12 to 18-year-old junior high and senior high students. And now the task was given to them to try to engage and equip 18 to 30-year-old young adults in various stages of life. And the results remained and still do remain the same. The young adults are discontinuing their faith and developing a disposition of a nun. Now, Stetzer defines nuns in this way: the growing number of Americans who have given up on God, or at least on organized religion. The number of postmoderns who fall into this subgroup of young adults marks a lot of postmoderns. Most identify or at least become heavily influenced by postmodernism. And I think that we would all, if we were honest, recognize what a great influence postmodern the philosophy has had on our thought process. And Neil Cole suggests that postmoderns do not view organized church as a place to find spiritual guidance. Consequently, the Vernon Church young adults either became unattached to any form of faith or they remained loose on their beliefs. But they rarely attended organized services. Now, in their defense, in Vernon Church's defense, more than several ceased joining corporate worship or a small group event because of the pool of college or job offer that moved them far from the area. It is a small area in this town, small town, and so for them to stay is not appealing. Of those who did move, very few continued walking in their faith faithfully. In a positive light, though, the church seeks to engage young adults from what Stetzer calls a congregational Christian to a convictional Christian. According to Stetzer, a congregational Christian is one who grew up in church, they were raised in church, their parents brought them to church, they were either drugged to church, you never know, and they perhaps even received their marriage certificate here at the church. But they are really not practicing any sort of real, vibrant faith. They are basically attendees and only attendees. Some people would call them Christers. They would only come on Christmas or Easter. But convictional Christians are vastly different in that they actually live according to their faith. And they would say that they have met with Jesus. This is what we're hoping for our college-age students to become. Now, this department of hyphen or college-age students, it shows a small glimmer of hope from time to time, but no promised incremental growth for the future. The Vernon Church prays earnestly, and we pray frequently, but with no sure plan in operation to meet the need of our local assembly. Perhaps the reason gauges the shift of focus for the church because where one area lacks attention or has lacked attention, another has gained momentum. Now, the awareness of decline from the young adults is present and is shown in a mass survey sent to the church. The church recognized the absence of young adults. However, the growth within our Celebrate Recovery continues to grow in leaps and bounds. Several, if not the majority, of those who participate in that ministry are young adults who seek to be transitioned from a nun to a convictional Christian. The need was there in our community, and the response it is astounding. Now, in an interview with the director of Celebrate Recovery, she voiced, and we were just talking in the office one day, and she said, I had a passion and a love for ministry that I didn't know was there. A burden was and is still present. And in our church, it is a burden that has been kind of shared from the director to the church. And someone had the energy and time to invest in them with passion and purpose. Growth in the young adults area of the church still needs attention, though there is emerging in a mesh from Celebrate Recovery, those who are coming from the outside of the local community coming in, but there still needs to be this the need for those who are coming up in the church. But the church, spiritually and numerically, according to the church attendance records and the consensus from the church, remains at a steady growth. Signs of decay or death for the church overall is not overwhelming, and it does not concern them. They believe that they are poised for revival and growth in the future. So here's the question. What type of culture is conveyed in this focal group? How do people feel when they come into the building? Or how do people feel when they are interacting with the group? Do they feel assimilated? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they can come here and worship freely? These are the questions that we're getting ready to answer in this next section. There is evidence of a cultural clash at the Vernon Church, both derived from a modern and a postmodern way of thinking. Two statements might identify both tensions. The postmodern viewpoint says, this is how we should move forward to advance the kingdom or the gospel. The modernism outlook says, this is the way we've always done it. A culture of discipleship gradually emerges at the Vernon Church, despite the tension. A few years ago, an interview with the senior pastor gave way to a cultural awareness the church desperately needed. After our weekly staff meeting, I inserted a question in which I was curious. Pastor, what is the mission of our church? Before he could respond, I threw a disclaimer in front and said, let me clarify. I know the church as a whole must follow the Great Commission, but what does that look like for our local assembly? He paused briefly and said, we exist to glorify God and to make disciples. That is our mission. When I heard it, it made sense, but it was the first time I had heard it. I knew if it was the first time I heard it, then the mission statement, the staff could not articulate it when they were asked. So we endeavored to establish a culture conducive for the mission. The survey we presented electronically revealed positive movement toward engaging the culture the pastor hoped to develop. The question of the survey asked, what is your relationship like with your non-Christian friends? The results unveiled a promising cultural shift. 85% claimed the relationships were excellent, and only 15% said the relationships were weird or shallow. The mission of the church remains, glorify God and make disciples. However, the culture also reveals how one goes about doing that. Back to the interview with the senior pastor, I asked how one goes about making a disciple, and he responded, turn a stranger into a friend into a disciple. Turn a stranger into a friend to a disciple. It would seem that the culture is learning toward that model. Of course, God's kingdom is always countercultural, and it will look much different from the culture of the world. The opposing culture within the church, or the damaging, worn, or in need of change culture, has a title. sitting on your laurels. We notice a slight tweak to the discipleship model to a desired events-based model or an attractional model. Cole reminds us that an attractional model, the flow is always coming into the church, which is rooted and bound to a geographical location. He further illustrates, in a sense, the attractional expression of church is like a lake waiting to receive from other tributaries. Jesus did not say sit and stay, but go and tell. The culture does display a decaying aspect found in the Tom Rainer's book entitled Autopsy of a Deceased Church. He states, with parallels to already dead churches, that obedience to the Great Commission faded. It usually faded gradually. It's not like one day the church was sending out dozens of members into the community and it suddenly stopped. Instead, they declined in the outward focus was gradual. This cultural mindset in Vernon Church is also content on relishing over the glory days of the past. The status quo and the way things were are good enough for those adherent to this culture to stagnate without a move for change. Yes, we respect the past. At times we revere the past, but we can't live in the past. We have to move on. A subculture found inside this mindset suggests the staff do most of the work while the layperson only joins in the mission on the Sunday service. Instead, Vernon Church hopes to educate by teaching biblical principles that reveal the need for every individual to participate, inspire by telling stories, sharing testimonies about the life-changing moments in disciples, and finally celebrate those who bring new disciples in a public celebration. Vernon Church assumes that whatever is rewarded will be repeated. In a positive sign, a responder to the electronic survey typed an encouraging bend to the culture Vernon Church hopes to make. And they typed with excitement, outreach. It's not enough to post on social media, which has been fantastic since COVID started. We need to be the church and get out in the community. The Vernon Church, of course, agrees and looks forward to what the culture that looks like to follow. A positive shift is, there's a positive shift in the right direction for Vernon Church. Based on the survey that was given to the church by way of SurveyMonkey, the church reasonably relates to immediate context, their immediate context. The question posed read this way: when you see a former drug user or a drug user, really, come into our church building or to our group, what is your first emotion? Now, unfortunately, the small town Vernon Church is overrun with generations of meth and heroin users. However, it is an opportunity for the church to show the love of Christ. And the mission of Vernon Church to glorify God and to make disciples. That is the mission of Vernon Church, is to glorify God and make disciples. Now, a slow paradigm shift and one that is moving incrementally is this: the attractional versus the missional type of church remains in tension. Those who go and bring the kingdom of God to the world is the mission of the church, and that is very clear. Those who seek to remain an attractional church, hoping others will come to it, still find contradiction within themselves, because those on the move were steadily bringing the lost to them or seeking to find the lost. Now, the options to answer the questions were, they were either excited to see them, hesitant, fear, or cautious. 68% were excited to see them, 6% felt hesitant to go around them, and 25% stood cautious when they entered the room. Now, the outstanding statistic that's not there is that 0% of the people actually fear them. But I would wager that if we would have asked this 365 days ago, a year ago, that number would have flopped, that there would have been 68% of people that were fearing them. But there is a culture shift. Now, based on the matrix of attitudes presented by Gabe Leons in the PowerPoint, the Vernon Church displays a hint of judgmental attitude toward the world and the lost. Another question in the survey answered by the church provides more data into this reality. The question read, what is your first reaction when you see someone new come into our church building? The responses or the choices that they could have chosen are: I immediately go to them for greeting, I tend to wave from afar, or I usually let other people handle the hellos. More than a quarter, 26%, said that they decided to let other people handle the hellos, and 33% chose to wave from afar. Only 40% of the surveyors wanted to converse and connect with those who were different from them. The surveyors who decided to only engage from afar, or not all, displayed with their body language they have shown a few unfavorable images to outsiders that they do not want to connect with them. An outsider can readily recognize through body language they're not interested. According to Gabe Leon's research, outsiders would assume that the Vernon Church is judgmental, confusing, and insensitive to others. Nevertheless, 40% of those who decide to engage is much better than 0%. As the culture shifts, the Vernon Church hopes the statistics will dramatically change for the better and see more practical applications for the church's mission. And the church's mission here is to glorify God and make disciples. So what ministry paradigms do we see here at the Vernon Church? The ministry paradigms in operation at Vernon Church include the acronym SET, Shepherd, Evangelist, and Teachers. The office of a senior leader or the former pastor is in place, juxtaposed to newly elected pastor who operates in the role of teacher. Now, the former pastor takes a position commonly referred to in the church culture as bishop. The elected pastor serves in the teacher role here at Vernon Church. According to a separate poll given to our church staff, a few questions emerged. The first question was, do you know of a modern day apostle or a modern day pastor or a modern day prophet? And the shocking conclusion from our team, both answers reached above 60%. But ironically, none of them operate in our church, both apostle and prophet. The group embraces a mild form of APEST, or apostle, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers, but only recognize them in different circles or churches in the surrounding region. The Vernon Church shepherd exemplifies a plethora of qualities and functions displayed by Hirsch and Kacham. His leadership style mimics a collaborative mindset to include others in the process of growth. He tirelessly works to know the church's pulse by cultivating and integrating people into a social, cohesive community that fosters relational health and discipleship. To clarify, the church operates under the assumption that there remains only one shepherd over the entire congregation. If this would change as we continue to grow, I'm not sure, but right now at 120, at 150, they think that that's okay. Still, several leaders serve in the capacity of a shepherd over their ministries. In other words, they are overseers. The primary shepherd champions the call for discipleship, and therefore a trickle down of leadership burden is distributed evenly to reach inwardly and outwardly effectively. The evangelist paradigm responsibility in the Vernon Church has distributed equally to all members of the church. Vernon Church realized in previous years, similar to Hirsch and Kacham, that the American megachurch is largely the result of evangelistic approaches and leadership because it was a direct result of the church's taking evangelism seriously. It has brought millions of new converts, and we agree with that in the church, but then it did not quite know what to do with them once they were baptized. Therefore, similar to Willow Creek, Vernon Church adopted a model of discipleship and relational approaches rather than the former seeker-sensitive methods of the past. The culture remains in tension with those who have not seen participation in evangelism necessary to their relationship with the gospel. The teacher paradigm at Vernon Church is not a shared experience among all members. It is a shared effort among many staff and an expected role performed by the church community. A Vernon Church, teachers also ask the question, How does this line up with the theology and scripture that we hope to express to the community and the church? The constant avenue for teachers' concerns remains: what theology do we advocate in our worship lyrics during corporate church worship? They ask, do we really believe that? And if so, are we articulating the principles properly? Engaging in dialogue with the shepherd and amongst themselves monthly, they attempt to answer questions similar to the one posed above. Furthermore, the design from the electronic survey served as a reflective purpose. The question posed two paradigms that do not exist inside the culture and framework at Vernon Church. However, the answers that they clicked leave us with three assumptions about the church staff. Number one, they believe the functions of apostles and prophets exist somewhere. They know at least one to whom they can associate the role. And lastly, they can even assume they exist inside the Vernon Church framework. From a participant's observer's perspective, many here at the Vernon Church have the traits to serve in those roles, but no current person or persons serve in that way quite yet. Now, an alarming answer to the polled question concerned bivocational leadership, and it reflects a potential red flag for a decaying church. The question sought to answer this question: is vocational ministry recognized and given its proper place? The participant observer, me, worded the question this way: should a pastor work a job outside of the church? They didn't have a lot of options to choose from. It was either yes or no. And 12.5% said yes, but the other 87.5% said no. The vocational ministry has its proper place, and the church community intended to keep it there. However, at times, the culture at Vernon Church mirrors a concept that Thomas Rainer suggests is an indicator of a dying and decaying church. When pastors become caretakers of members only. Recently, in a staff meeting, or what Thomas Rainer refers to as the business meeting from Hades, a vocational ministry dilemma emerged. In context, the church was in the middle of deciding to hold one Sunday morning service juxtaposed with two services on Sundays. The vocational ministry, overwhelmed by both services expressed concern with burnout and the overuse of volunteers. Eventually, the meeting escalated and the pastor shouted, "I am tired of feeding fat sheep." Of course, it got really quiet in the room, and really tense in the room, and really awkward in the room. Now, though his comment was valid, I believe it was birthed out of a church that solely considers the workload to fall on vocational ministry. The church has the vocational ministry in the proper place in terms of its necessity, but they may have a warped view on its functionality. What is the health of our staff and church and the state of our church look like? Accordingly, when we contemplate the value of vocational ministry, bivocational ministry comes along with those who volunteer and make up most of our focal group's capacity to serve. Most staff at Vernon Church work secular jobs and serve passionately for the church and are forerunners for the mission, for the church's mission. And once again, that is to glorify God and make disciples. The electronic survey posed several questions that might identify the pulse of the group's ability to lead effectively and healthy. The first question asked, do you practice regular Sabbath? And that's a 24 hours off the pressures of work and school to focus on family, yourself, and God, not necessarily in that order. And 62% voiced that they did. And the other 37% typed that they did not. More than half the team at Vernon Church attempts to find rest in God, but the group's weak point remains. Cesaro suggests that the bias of families and cultures to define and value one another, not by who we are, but also what we do. That kind of pressure is not easy to resist. The participant observer, me, agrees the pressure is evident in this group. We are always working. We are so busy. The senior pastor voices the need to maintain the Sabbath rhythm, but works 7 days a week relentlessly. He may be at home, but he's really working, and he never really shuts it off, at least not from what I've seen. And he is highly accomplished in the community. Even as a vocational pastor, he is out in the community and is successful within the church arena as a sought-after speaker, conference speaker, world-renowned speaker. However, the clear message from the leadership down is similar to that of Cesaro. The clear message is this: in his family growing up was, you are what you accomplished. What leadership asserts the need for Sabbath, but communicates the opposite values. According to the answers, a steady diet of Sabbath will help the focal group's health. Now, another question that helps assess the group's health was, what is your current stress level from 1 to 100? Obviously 100 being the top, you are super stressed out, or 1, you are pretty good and you are practicing Sabbath. It was just another way to kind of go behind that back door and answer the question of Sabbath. And 50% of the group said over 50 from 1 to 100. The participant observer, me, suggests a Sabbath perspective of time off from the ongoing stress of life to devote considerable time to family and God. I have seen, and I'm witnessing, and I've even seen it myself, that when I don't have Sabbath and when the team doesn't have Sabbath, we're not really able to truly focus on the mission of the church, and that's people. And when we're tired, we can't really minister to people. The next question gives way to a need for Sabbath. This was the question: is this a difficult season for you right now? 62% said yes, and the other 37.5% clicked no. Cesaro inserts a quote from his friend Sam. He writes, "If you do not keep Sabbath, God will keep it for you. If you do not keep Sabbath, we are incurring a deficit, and God himself will stop us through a crisis, a health issue, an emergency, or anything that gets our attention. Vernon Church is in danger of burnout if it does not seek Sabbath for themselves." The group is incrementally excelling in shaping their perspective into a postmodern, capable of reaching their community model. The Vernon Church cut the majority of its programs and sought to become more relational with people instead of offering more venues for visitors to get lost in, leaving the old ways of doing church for new. Usually more relational options, less dependent on clergy and programs, have emerged. The group has married both a mission for the church and a mission that intrigues the postmodern mind. The postmodern values relationships. They value relationships more than that mission. And the Vernon Church mission seeks to merge both, to glorify God and make disciples through one relationship at a time. So to conclude, this is not an exhaustive analysis of both the church and the staff at Vernon Church. It would take months to observe fully, and I would love to be a church analyst one day. But as the participant observer, me, I've gleaned much from interviews and surveys. However, a 360-degree brief overview of the nature and context of ministry, Vernon Church displays many strengths and a few weaknesses and areas for growth.